I still remember the exact sound of the ice in my water glass settling, that tiny clink, like the room itself was holding its breath. My boyfriend's father had just said, with complete confidence, that the new generation of engineers didn't understand load-bearing systems the way his generation did. He was looking at me when he said it. Not accusatory exactly, more like a professor looking at a promising but clearly underprepared student. I took a small sip of water. I didn't say anything. That night was 3 months ago, and I've thought about it more times than I expected to. Not with bitterness. I want to be clear about that. More with a kind of quiet wonder at how differently a room can look depending on which side of a door you walked in through. My boyfriend's name is Levi. We've been together for 2 years, and I love him in the specific way you love someone who has seen you at your most overwhelmed and stayed anyway. He's a landscape architect, which means he spends his days thinking about how water drains and where light falls in the afternoon, and he talks about it with the same focus I bring to my own work. We were a good match from the beginning. We both understood the particular tiredness of carrying a project in your head even when you're not at work. His parents live about 4 hours from us outside of Knoxville. We'd done holidays over video call for the first year. They were traveling, then we were swamped, then one thing and another. His mother I'd spoken to on the phone several times. She laughed often and asked real questions. His father, I knew primarily through the stories Levi told. What I knew, he'd spent 32 years as a structural engineer at a civil engineering firm called Aldrin and Webb. He'd retired 4 years ago at 64. He was proud of his work. He had opinions about concrete. What Levi told me, almost as a casual aside, maybe 3 weeks before the visit, he might say something about your firm. He has some history there. I asked what kind of history. He worked with them on a bridge project in the 90s. It didn't end well. Contractual thing. He's not bitter about it, but he has feelings. The firm he was referring to was Callaway Structural, where I am, as of 14 months ago, the youngest principal engineer in the firm's 40-year history. I was 29 when they offered me the position. I am now 31. I didn't think much about the coincidence at the time. The engineering world is not that large. Histories overlap. We drove up on a Friday. The house was a craftsman-style place set back from a 2-lane road with a deep porch and a garden that Levi's mother, whose name is Margot, had been tending for 20 years. She came out before we'd even gotten out of the car. She was exactly as warm in person as she'd been on the phone. A small woman with short silver hair and the kind of handshake that means business. His father came out behind her. His name is Gerald. He's a large man, not heavy, just substantial. 6'2" probably, with wide shoulders and the posture of someone who spent decades on job sites. His handshake was the firmest I'd encountered in recent memory, and he held eye contact for just a beat longer than felt casual. Not aggressive. Evaluating. "So you're the engineer," he said. "I am," I said. He nodded once, like I'd confirmed a suspicion, and let us inside. Dinner that first night was relaxed. Margot made pot roast. We talked about Levi's projects, about a hiking trail they'd done in the Smoky Mountains the previous fall, about a documentary Gerald had watched about the Tay Bridge disaster in Scotland. That one I leaned into. I knew the Tay Bridge. It was a case study I'd taught twice. We had a good 20 minutes on that. I thought, going to bed, this is fine. He's reserved but not unfriendly. He'll warm up. The second night is the one I'm writing about. Margot had invited her sister and her sister's husband over for dinner. Her sister's name is Vara, and her husband is a retired contractor named Chuck, who immediately found a kindred spirit in Gerald. They sat across from each other and talked about jobs they'd done in the 80s like two people comparing war stories, which, in construction, is not entirely an inaccurate comparison. I was seated next to Vera, who was cheerful and asked me questions about living in the city and whether I thought the housing market was going to do anything sensible in the next decade. I told her I genuinely didn't know. She seemed to find this refreshingly honest. At some point, I want to say we were on the second bottle of wine, Gerald turned to me. "Levy says you work in structural," he said. "That's right. What firm?" Here it was. I kept my voice even. "Callaway Structural." Something moved behind his eyes. Just for a second. He picked up his fork again. Good firm, he said, in a tone that suggested the next sentence would complicate that assessment. They've been around a long time, I offered. He cut a piece of roast. They've also made some choices over the years I wouldn't have made. Any firm that's been around 40 years has made some of those, I said. He looked at me for a moment, then nodded slightly like he was granting me that point. Fair enough. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. Chuck asked, somewhere between the salad and dessert, whether I mostly did commercial work or residential. I said commercial, primarily large scale, bridges, transit infrastructure, the occasional stadium. Gerald set his glass down. That's where the complexity is, he said, and he wasn't talking to Chuck anymore. He was talking to me, but in the way you talk to someone you're instructing rather than conversing with. Most firms your age, I mean firms staffed by people at your career stage, they know how to execute a design, running calculations, managing contractors. The harder part is understanding why the original decisions were made, the intuition behind the engineering. He said your age the way you might say your level. I nodded. Takes years to develop that, he continued. I see it missing in a lot of younger engineers. They're trained well technically, but they come out of school thinking the software does the thinking for them. That's a real problem, I said, which was true, and also bought me a moment. You have to understand the load paths in your bones, he said. Not just on paper, especially with bridge work. You get complacent, you get comfortable deferring to the model, and then you're standing on a job site watching something fail that the software said would hold. He was leaning forward slightly. He was enjoying this, not maliciously. I want to be accurate about this. He was enjoying it the way people enjoy the things they know deeply. He had real knowledge and he was sharing it, and he simply had no idea he was sharing it with someone who had been hired, specifically to lead the people he was describing. Levi was quiet beside me. He'd caught my eye once, very briefly, with an expression that I could only read as I'm sorry. And also, I see you. I gave him the smallest possible nod that meant, it's okay, I've got it. The Meridian Overpass project, Gerald said at some point. I'd lost track of exactly how we got there. Early 2000s. Callaway was involved in that as a subcontractor. Do you know it? I know of it, I said carefully. There were decisions made on that project that still bother me, he said. Connection details that were not wrong exactly, but not conservative enough. Not what I would have done. I'd be curious what specifically concerned you, I said. He looked at me with the particular slight surprise of someone who expected a different response, acquiescence maybe, or a polite change of subject. Instead, he told me, in some detail, what had bothered him about the connection specifications on the east approach span. I listened. He was not wrong. He was working from incomplete information. He'd been on the project for 8 months and had not seen the later geotechnical reports that changed the calculus, but his instincts were directionally correct. The geotechnical data that came in late on that project actually supported the specifications as built, I said when he finished. I don't know if you saw the final soil reports. The bearing capacity was higher than the preliminary assessment suggested, which was why the connection details look lighter than they should on paper. He went still. Not upset. Just recalibrating. You know that project, he said. I know it reasonably well, I said. It's 20 years old, he said. We do a lot of case study work, I said, which was true. It was also true that I knew the Meridian project because I'd spent 6 weeks last year leading an internal review of our firm's involvement in 12 projects from that era as part of a client audit. I knew the soil reports because I'd read them. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, more carefully than before, "What's your role at Callaway exactly?" I told him. The table went quiet in the specific way that tables go quiet when information has just redistributed itself. Chuck let out a low whistle. Vera said, "Oh, honey," to me in a tone that was equal parts delight and vindication. Margot, who I would later learn had known my role since our third phone call, took a very composed sip of her wine. Gerald was quiet for a stretch. Not long, maybe 90 seconds, which is actually a substantial silence when everyone at a table is aware of it. He was looking at the space between his plate and his glass. Then he looked at me directly. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I've been talking to you like you were a junior draftsman." "You were sharing things you know well," I said. "Some of it was things I needed to hear when I was 24. Not all of it lands the same now, but I understood where it was coming from." He studied me for a moment. "That's a generous read. I'm trying to be accurate." "The geotechnical point," he said. "I didn't know that. It wasn't public, it was internal to the project." He nodded slowly. "They should have disclosed that to subcontractors." "They should have," I agreed. Something eased between us after that. It wasn't immediate and it wasn't complete. You don't rebuild an assumption in 20 minutes. But it shifted. He asked me, later, over coffee, about a project we were currently in design development on. A transit bridge in the mid-Atlantic. He asked smart questions, the kind that come from decades of intuition, and I answered them honestly, including the parts where we were still working out how to solve something. He said, at one point, "You're not protective about the uncertainty. I've found it's worse to pretend it isn't there." He smiled at that, a real one. Levi and I went for a walk after everyone had gone home. It was cold, past 10, and the road was dark except for a strip of moon above the tree line. "I should have prepared him," Levi said. "How would you have done that?" "I don't know. Told him who you were. You did tell him I was an engineer at Callaway. I should have said principal engineer." I thought about that for a moment. I'm not sure it would have changed anything. He had to arrive at it himself. Levi was quiet for a few steps. "Were you angry?" "Not really," I said, which surprised me slightly but was true. More. I kept waiting to see what kind of person he was. Whether he was someone who doubled down or someone who could reset. "And he reset," I said. "That's not nothing." Levi took my hand. We walked the rest of the loop without talking much, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. There's a thing I've noticed about that particular variety of assumption, the one where someone looks at you and writes a story about what you must know and what you're probably missing. It usually isn't cruelty. More often it's just a person working from incomplete data, filling in the blanks with what seems statistically likely. Young woman at the dinner table. They assume she's adjacent to the industry rather than inside it. They assume she's listening to absorb, not listening to evaluate. The assumption itself doesn't bother me the way it used to. I've stopped needing people to see me correctly in the first 5 minutes. What matters is what happens in the minutes after the correction. Gerald called Levi 2 weeks later. Levi told me about it afterward, a little surprised by it. His father had asked for my contact information because he had a question about a retaining wall situation on a property his neighbor was having trouble with. Not a big project. A residential fix. The kind of thing I'd normally redirect to someone more focused on that scale. But I called him back. We talked for 45 minutes. He knew what he was talking about. Once he stopped instructing and started talking with me, the conversation opened up considerably. He ended the call by saying, "I told my old colleagues at Aldrin that my son is dating Callaway's principal structural." There was a pause. "I hope that's all right," he said. A beat late, as though he realized he maybe should have asked first. "That's fine," I said. "They were impressed," he said. And I could hear in his voice that he was too, and that he was also, maybe, a little proud. Not in a way that belonged to him, he knew that. But in the way you're proud when something good is close to you. I didn't point out the shift. I just let it be what it was. Levi asked me once, sometime after that, what I would have done if his father had doubled down instead of recalibrating. I told him I would have been polite for the rest of the weekend and formed a clear private opinion. "And us?" he asked. "You're not your father's choices," I said, "but I'd want to know how you talked about it after." He understood what I meant by that. The truth is, I've learned that you can't know someone from the worst version of a moment. Gerald didn't show me his worst. He showed me an assumption, which is something nearly everyone carries, and then he showed me what he did with it when it stopped being tenable. That second part is the one I pay attention to. Some people have to be the smartest in the room so badly that being corrected costs them something real. Their posture changes, their voice sharpens, they find a way to reframe it so they were right all along. Gerald didn't do that. He sat with it for 90 seconds and then apologized, cleanly, without footnotes. That's rarer than people realize. The next time we visited, in the spring, he showed me something he'd been working on in the garage. A scale model of a highway interchange he designed back in 1991. Still the project he was most proud of. He built the model in retirement from memory and old drawings. It was meticulous. The kind of thing that takes a long time and means something to the person doing it. He walked me through the design logic, why he'd chosen the ramp configuration he had, what the soil conditions had required, how the geometry had been determined by a water main that couldn't be relocated. I asked him questions. He answered them seriously, the way you answer someone whose questions you respect. Margot brought us coffee without being asked and set it on the workbench and went back inside without saying anything, which told me she had seen this scene before and was glad to see it. You should write some of this down, I told Gerald. He looked at the model. Who would read it? I would, I said. And younger engineers who are going to make the same mistakes you watched other people make. The institutional knowledge in people like you doesn't transfer automatically. It disappears when you stop talking. He was quiet for a moment. I'll think about it, he said. I don't know if he will. But he's still thinking about it, as far as I know, and sometimes that's where things start. What I took from that weekend, and from the ones that followed, is something I've tried to be careful about applying to my own behavior. I know things. I've earned knowing them. But the version of me that assumes the person across the table knows less is not a version I want to operate as. Because that assumption is almost always at least partially wrong, and sometimes it's embarrassingly wrong, and by the time you find out, you've already done the thing. Gerald taught me something by accident, not about engineering, about the specific variety of grace involved in updating quickly and without defense when you find out you've had the picture wrong. I still think about that dinner, the silverware settling, the moment before I answered his question about my role. There's a version of that story where I correct him immediately, loudly, in a way that makes the point and wins the room. I've never been especially tempted by that version. The longer game is more interesting, and the ending is better, not because anyone loses, but because nobody has to. I've thought about what would have happened if I'd corrected Gerald at the first moment he slipped into lecture mode. Somewhere around the time he said, "Your age," with that particular weight behind it. I could have said it plainly. I'm the principal engineer at Callaway. I run the department you used to work alongside. I'd been doing this for over a decade, and I know the Meridian project because I spent 6 weeks auditing it last year. I could have done that. It would have landed. The table would have gone quiet a beat earlier, and I would have technically been right. But here's what I've come to believe. Not from a book or a philosophy class, just from years of watching how things actually play out between people. The moment you force a correction, you own the outcome. You've made someone small in front of others, and they carry that. Even if they handle it with grace in the room, something closes. You got your point. And you also got a version of that person who now has a reason to stay defended. What happened instead is that Gerald arrived at the truth on his own terms. He asked me directly what my role was. He heard the answer. He sat with it for 90 seconds, which is actually a long time to sit with being wrong. And then he apologized without conditions. No footnotes. No, well, I couldn't have known. Just, I owe you an apology. I'd been talking to you like you were a junior draftsman. That's not a small thing. That requires a particular kind of character. The kind that gets built over decades of being held accountable on job sites where being wrong has consequences. Gerald had it, and I think he could only show it because the situation didn't back him into a corner. He had room to move. That's the part I keep coming back to. Patience isn't passive. It's strategic in the best sense, not manipulative, but wise. When you wait, you give the other person the chance to become who they actually are. If Gerald had doubled down, I would have known something true and important about him. Because he reset, I learned something else equally true. Either way, I would have gotten accurate information. I just liked this version better. The restraint cost me something in the moment. Sitting there while someone explains load-bearing systems to you, systems you've been calculating professionally for years, requires a specific kind of stillness. Your instinct wants to surface, but I've learned that my instinct to prove myself is not always my wisest impulse. Sometimes it just wants the room. That's not the same as needing it. What I carry from that weekend is something I try to apply to my own assumptions now. I know things. I worked hard to know them, and I'm not apologetic about that. But knowing things has a way of making you certain, and certainty has a way of making you stop listening, and stopping listening is exactly how Gerald ended up explaining the Meridian Project to the person who'd just spent 6 weeks reading its original soil reports. He was smart. He was experienced. He was also, for a stretch of 2 days, completely wrong about who he was talking to. I could be that person. So could you. The only real protection against it is staying genuinely curious about the person across the table. Not performing curiosity, actually having it, and being willing to update fast and cleanly when the picture changes. Gerald called me a few weeks later with a question about a retaining wall. He asked it like a peer. That mattered more to me than any moment of being right at the dinner table ever could have.